Welcome, everybody, to a live Remarkable Leadership podcast. And let me just say this, leaders are in the influence business. I've said that for years. It's profoundly true. But what does that look like in today's world? Our guest today challenges us to think beyond influence to transformational influence. We'll talk about what that means and what it takes to lead with Transfluence. Welcome to another episode of the live version of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. You can get all future live episodes and not have to wait for them to come out on your app. And then also you can interact with us if you come with us live. We'd love to have you do that. And you can join us for if you're watching this or listening to it later and you want to get the lives in the future, just go to either remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkable.com/LinkedIn. Pick your favorite, join us there, and be aware of when we're live in the future. Today's episode is brought to you by The Long Distance Teammate, our new book. If you work remotely and you want to be more effective and more productive and more engaged and more connected, then this book will help you get there. Because there's a big difference between working from home and being an engaged and effective member of a remote team. You can learn more and pre-order your copy at longdistanceteammate.com. And how about we get started? Let me introduce this good-looking guy that's sitting here with me, Walt Rakowich. I'm going to get it wrong. Walt Rakowich. It's like a sandwich. That's why I got it in my head, and I still got it wrong. Walt, let me tell you about Walt, and we'll dive in just a second. Walt is the former CEO of Prologis, a New York Stock Exchange company, and a member of the Fortune. Man, I'm having trouble, everybody, today. It's because I'm trying to look down instead of looking at you. Let me get this right and do it the way I know I ought to do it. How about that? And I'll introduce Walt over. Walt is the former CEO of Prologis, which is a New York Stock Exchange company and a member of the S&P 500, a global real estate company that was near collapse when he took over as CEO in 2008. During that economic downturn, the stock dropped from over $70 a share to approximately $2 a share in 10 months, making it the third worst performing company in the S&P 500 that year. After Walt joined as CEO, he quickly implemented a change in culture through transparency, orchestrating a dramatic turnaround and restoring its position in the industry. He's the author of the new book, Transfluence: How to Lead with Transformative Influence in Today's Climates of Change. In addition to speaking to audiences on a range of leadership topics, he also serves on a number of corporate and philanthropic boards. He's talking to us today from his home in Denver. He is our guest. And Walt, I'm glad that you're here. Welcome.
Well, thanks, Kevin. Great to be on the show. I'm just so excited to be here.
Well, let's dive in. So that's a pretty good story. And when you read the book, you get the chance to hear a little bit about that story. You worked for the organization, chose to retire because of some variety of things, and then was asked to come back a few months later. So just give us the higher level view. Basically, the question you asked me before we went live, give us a little bit about the journey, sort of what led you to where you got and to where you are now.
Well, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so please don't hold that against me. I'm a Steeler fan.
Go Steelers, man. Yeah. I'm fine with the Steelers.
And I just I always tell people that I hit the parent lottery, Kevin. I just had wonderful parents. We didn't really have that much, but boy, I grew up with a tremendous amount of love and support, and my folks were not pretentious people at all, and they didn't have that much. So that sometimes it's good that you don't, so they loved people and they took people for who they were, and I think that really influenced my leadership journey. And fast forward to the story that you told. I had been with the company for roughly 15 years before the collapse occurred in 2008, and it was the year before that when I was the number 2 person. I had risen throughout the organization. I was chief financial officer, risen, and you could just feel the market getting really squishy. Lehman had declared bankruptcy, and we were doing things that we shouldn't be doing. We were way too aggressive. We had We had a CEO that was one of the most brilliant people that you'll ever meet, but didn't always listen to the things that we wanted to do, and didn't trust, and a whole host of things. And it bothered me enough to leave the company, and I did leave the company, and right after that is when the company collapsed, and after that I had to come back and restore trust and restore faith in the company, and take it from a company that was on the verge of bankruptcy to a company that is what it is today. And that was a tremendous amount of work, and that was my crucible leadership moment, if you will, and that's what got me to writing this book.
Yeah, you talk about it throughout the book, the lessons that come from that, and I want to get to some of those in a bit. But there's just a few things. I actually wrote to a group of people this morning that I was going to be chatting with you today, and I said this is one of the 5 best books I've read this year. And I read a lot, so I love the book. There's a lot of great stuff in it, and I want to just go through some of the things there, and then I want to, and I know that you'll come back to some of those lessons from that crucible and through that time. But I want to get at some of the key ideas in the book first. So first of all, you're the brave guy that introduces a new word, even though I misspelled it here. You're the brave guy that introduces a new word in the title of the book. So define transfluence for us.
Well, transfluence is actually short for transformational influence. And as a leader, I think you've got a lot of things to focus on. And of course, the number one thing is what people call the destination, which is Walt Rakowich turned the company around. Or it
yesterday, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or it might be, grow earnings by X, or whatever that is. That's the destination. That's what you're supposedly leading for. The fact of the matter is, the most important thing in leadership is the journey. It's what happens along the way. And I truly believe that the most important thing you can do as a leader is be influential in the lives of those people that you lead. And sometimes we miss that. We miss that. And so transfluence is the word for transformational influence. It's all about making leadership is all about making a transformational influence in the lives of those you lead. Fundamentally, what I talk about in the book is it's not about you. And unfortunately, too many leaders think it's about them. It's about their destination. It's about what they've been put in the job to do. It's not about them. It's about influencing other people. And that really the most important thing with to do there is to build trust in your organization. Build trust. If you build trust, essentially you can complete any job. You can complete any destination that you're after. But it's all about that journey. It's about building trust with your people and having influence on them along the way.
I actually think that's the last line in the book. That's not about us. It's about them. I think it's something like that is the last line. And we are in complete agreement on that. And one of the things you talk about in the book is the idea that we've got to be careful and be aware that selfishness is one of the biggest challenges that we face, because it's the opposite of selflessness. You want to just talk about that briefly? I know it's going to be woven throughout everything we talk about here, but anything you want to say about that specifically?
Well, I think I talk a lot in the book about pride and fear, and and unfortunately, pride and fear are the two largest challenges I think leaders face. And why are they challenges? They're challenges because they're all about the leader. Even fear is about the leader. And I think it's so important to get out of your own way and be about the people around you. Invest in them. Show them you care. Show them you love them. And show them that you want them to succeed. And I think if you do that, you're on your way to building trust. So yes, I think selflessness is really a key tenet to what this is all about.
I think the chapters on fear and pride are two of my favorite chapters in the book. As it turns out, I'm glad that you sort of went back to that. Talk to us a little bit about what are the kinds of things that you see leaders fearing? There's some buckets that you talk about in the book. It's not meant to be a test, but like, what are some of the fears that you see leaders having to deal with? Because I think as people are watching and listening, I'd encourage you to be saying, how do these affect me, as Walt talks about them?
So the best way I can explain this, and I talk about this in the book, Kevin, is an article that Harvard Business Review did. And it really hit a chord. It was written about 5 years ago, so it's not recent, but it was called "What Do CEOs Fear?" And the interesting thing is that they interviewed over 100 C-level executives. They weren't all CEOs, and basically asked them, what are your largest fears? What are your biggest fears? And then they collected all of these responses. And you know what the number one fear was? The number one fear was incompetency. Now, you might think that these C-level executives would talk about, well, my largest fear is losing great employees, or my largest fear is, not being profitable this year, whatever it might be. No, the number one fear that they wrote down was incompetency. And, so CEOs—
they're going to find me out. They're going to
find me out. That's exactly right. That, I shouldn't be here. It's the imposter syndrome, right? Yeah. And they talked about how that led to dictatorial leaders because, fundamentally, I have to be right. And so this is the way it is,
and I can't let people get too close because then they'll figure out that I don't have all the answers.
That's exactly right. The second one is very similar. It's underachievement. It's, I'm going to underachieve. My competitor is going to do this, so then we need to do that first. And that led to, things like lack of discipline. I saw it at Prologis when we were buying assets when we shouldn't have been buying assets because the reason is because our competitors are going to do it, and so we can't possibly underachieve our competitors, or we can't possibly underachieve somebody else in the organization. And the third one, which really struck a chord with me, is appearing to be too vulnerable. Okay, this whole notion of vulnerability, leaders can't be vulnerable, and unfortunately, that led to a lack of delegation. I mean, CEOs and C-level executives were talking about how these things internally were affecting their performance. And when you look at those top three, they're all about the leaders, right? They're just all ingrained. And it's the same thing with pride. Fear and pride is just, it's just bundled up within you. And unfortunately, it forces you to lead and manage in ways that you shouldn't be, make decisions that you shouldn't make. And ultimately, that's why I talk in the book, you got to get out of that fear. You got to get out of that pride. And one of the ways of doing it is looking outside of yourself and beginning to think about the importance of all of those people around you and how can I make them better? And if you can change that mindset, I think you can accomplish great things.
Turn the mirror around, right? Get to quit looking at ourselves. I feel like I want to say something here, Walt. The article that you reference was Conversations with CEOs. And I've worked with leaders at all levels, and I know that you have as well. And yeah. I would say this to people who are lower in the ranks. Don't think that when you get to be the CEO, you're going to have it all figured out. And if you think that's only a list of fears for the CEO, you're missing the point, because all of us as leaders are feeling many of those things. And, if it's not one, it's another one. We've just got to be really aware. And I think this is a moment for us to sort of step back and not say, oh, that's an interesting survey of other people, but how does that influence me? And which of those things am I fearing, whether you're thinking about them at this moment or not? You want to add to that, Walt?
I do, Kevin. And you might be asking me this question down the road. So if I circumvent it, let me know.
It doesn't matter. It's all good. Go ahead.
No, you said as a CEO, you don't have all the answers. I mean, honestly, as a CEO, the one thing you have to understand, and I know all your listeners aren't CEOs, but we're leaders, and leaders have to understand that generally speaking, the people that work for you understand the details more than you do. And in fact,
it's not generally speaking, no. It's almost guaranteed.
And so you have to understand that this whole notion of vulnerability is real, but it's okay if you put yourself out there. You're a generalist. You're managing people. You're generally managing something that they know better than you. And the example that I cite in the book, and if you don't mind me telling your listeners this right now,
go ahead.
That really, I think, struck a chord internally with my people was I had been with the company I'd been back working as the CEO of the company for about a month and a half, and it was getting near Christmas. I had come back in November, and I was in a late night finance meeting with all of my finance people. And one of my finance people said, well, Walt, unfortunately, we're going to blow covenants on about $10 billion in bonds. And I go, whoa, when's that going to happen? And he said, pretty soon, like the first quarter. And I said, okay, well, what does that mean? And he said, well, unfortunately, it probably means that we're going to have to, declare bankruptcy. And so that the creditors, stave off the creditors. I said, and I tell you what, Kevin, I got white as a ghost. I didn't know what to say. I had come back to this company to try to, turn it around. And so I said, do you guys mind if I just leave for a minute? And they said, no, go ahead, Walt, do it. I walked down the hallway, turned the corner, and I'm ready to faint. And there's a desk in front of me, and and a chair next to the desk. And I said, I got to get there. And on my way to the desk, on the way to the chair, I don't make it. Fall down, hit my head on the desk, split open my head. And I'm laying there for what turned out to be 10 minutes or so, completely knocked out. And by the way, it's about 1 o'clock in the morning, completely dark. I get up in the office and I'm looking around, and I can't, for the first 30 seconds, have no idea where I am. Then I see the pool of blood. Then I recognize, oh my gosh, these people are still in the room. I go to the bathroom, suture up my head as best I could with my hands and got it to stop bleeding. Walk back in the room. I said, okay, well, let's talk about this bankruptcy thing. And I think it was my chief financial officer, but I can't remember for sure, said to me,
well, you weren't at 100% at the moment.
I said, Walt, before we talk about bankruptcy, can we talk about that big egg on your head? How did that happen? And I looked at the audience. I said, I got to tell you guys, you gave me the B word, and I'm the CEO. I'm supposed to know what to do. And the truth of the matter is, I don't have a clue. I mean, I don't know how to respond to this. I was here for 15 years. I'm watching this organization that I've been a part of for a long time in my life go down, and I don't know what to say. And it was like silence in the room, and everybody looked, and all of a sudden somebody said, you know what, Walt, don't worry about it. We got you covered. We're going to figure this out. And I recognized that day the power of vulnerability. It's so powerful. Now, you can't use it all the time, because if you do, somebody's going to wonder, well, why is this person in the job? But the truth of the matter is, it can be very powerful, used effectively. And I truly believe that it's empowering to other people. They feel empowered. All of a sudden, the CEO, by the way, doesn't have all the answers. We do. And we got to figure this thing out. And I felt just an amazing amount of pressure lifted from me that day just by saying the thing that I said. And I think that's a powerful thing. I truly believe that if more leaders did it, they'd create better cultures in their organizations.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation about vulnerability. A lot of people don't want to do it, and how do I do it, and how does it relate to transparency and all that stuff. I want to ask another question. We've got a great question that came in online I want to come back to, but while we're on vulnerability, I want to answer it real quick, or have you answer it real quick. And that is, okay, we don't be vulnerable about everything all of the time. So you're saying we got to pick our spots, if you will. So how do you do that? Like, how do you know when? Because we all know somewhere in our life, we know the oversharer that shares everything. Like, you don't want to be that person. Like, what advice do you have to people about picking your spots to be fully vulnerable?
Trust your heart. You never know. I can say, well, this is the situation you can, and this is the situation you can't. you guys got to trust your heart and be human. That's what this book is about. It's about being human as a leader and not believing that you need to have all the answers. Certainly you need to have some answers and you have to give people direction. I get that. But mostly it's about empowering them, you know, and putting your pride aside and doing what your heart tells you to do. Being human. It's sort of what would you do when you're around your friends? I mean, to a certain degree, you can be that way. Not always, but you can be that way. And so I don't know that I have the answer. It's a great question. I think it's a feel kind of thing. But I don't think that you need to be standoffish all the time as leaders, because people recognize that and they don't like that. Actually, they want you to be human around them.
So there was a question that came in when we were back talking about the fear stuff, and Felix asked this question. He said, is it genuine fear or a lack of self-confidence in the achievements and skills that got people there? You have a thought about that? I mean, obviously it manifests as fear. That was the question that people were asked, but how does it connect to that self-confidence piece in your mind? Felix,
that's a great question. I think it's more lack of self-confidence. Let me tell you this. I think I wrote this in the book, but the thing I love, Taylor Swift one time said that—
a great philosopher, Taylor Swift.
Oh, yeah, great philosopher. But you're right. I know, it's so funny. But she said that before she goes in front of any audience, she's scared to death. She's really nervous, but that got her to perform well. And Jack Nicklaus, I was just reading, I'm a big golf fan. I was just reading a book over the weekend where Jack Nicklaus said, you know what, if you don't go into every tournament having some level of fear, something's wrong. So Felix, your question is really good, because I don't think it's fear in and of itself. I think some fear is actually quite good. But I think when it begins to lead to insecurities, which relates to your lack of self-confidence, I think that's when it gets to you. I think if you can channel it in the right way, compartmentalize it, understand that it's actually okay, I think that's all right. But when it becomes about you and your insecurity, boy, that's where it gets powerfully dangerous, in my opinion.
You know, I used to do an exercise when I taught public speaking and trainers. I used to say, okay, tell me what are the things that you feel when you're really excited about something, like in your body. And then talk about heart rate goes up, you start to perspire, like give this whole list of things. And say, now tell me what's going on in your body when you fear something, when you're afraid of something. It's the same stuff. So I've heard the same story that you just said about Taylor Swift. I've heard Bob Hope say, I always knew when it wasn't going to go well, I didn't have that feeling before I went on stage. It's the same story, whether it's Bob Hope or Taylor Swift or you or me, right? And so it's how do we frame that in a way that helps us rather than getting in our way, right?
Yeah, and I would say just to add to what you said, to the extent that it helps you prepare more, great, fantastic. Allow that to happen. But to the extent that you begin to think, oh, I can't do it, that is the insecurity that leads you to make really bad decisions. Or someone will notice. Do you see what I'm saying?
Or someone will judge me or whatever, right?
Someone will judge me. That's fine. I mean, that's where you start getting into problems.
Exactly.
And behaving differently.
The interesting thing about this whole conversation is we're focusing our conversation around how do we become externally focused? How do we become focused not on how it's going to impact us, how we become selfless? And yet early in the book, you talk about what you call your 3H core, which is about us, right? So we couldn't have this conversation and not have you talk about this. You've mentioned some parts of it, but would you lay this out for us now?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So can I start off with the story as to how it came to me?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So, again, going through this crucible moment, I got a call from an investment banker friend of mine from Morgan Stanley. And you might recall in 2008, the whole world was going bankrupt. It wasn't just Prologis, but we were truly on the verge. But Goldman Sachs supposedly could go bankrupt. Morgan Stanley. I mean, there were a lot of big name companies, right? So my friend, investment banker Fred, said, "Hey, Walt, do you want to have a conversation with John Mack? He's the CEO of Morgan Stanley." And I had met John before, didn't know him that well, but I said, "Sure, I'd love to do that." And of course, back then you had the Treasury Secretary and the Fed trying to jam banks together. Who knew, how Morgan Stanley was going to end up? You had TARP, you had just a whole bunch of financial things happening in the market. And I got on the call and I said, "John, don't tell me about the things that are in the paper, and I don't really need to know the inside baseball. I just want to know, how are you managing your company in this difficult time?" And he paused for a moment and he said, "Walt, I manage my company on the basis of the 3 H's." And now he had me really intrigued. I said, "Okay, what is that?" Yeah, exactly. I'm listening in. He said, "The best leaders are humble, they're honest." And then he said, "In this day and age, a banker needs to have a sense of humor." So, and of course I laughed and I said, "There you go, touche. You got." So anyway, I went home, I started thinking about it more and more. And I do believe sometimes in elevator speeches. I believe in sort of, the 3 things that I need to remember as a person as I manage people. And I love that word humor, but I don't really view myself as a humorous person. But I think what John really was meaning was that people need to see the human side of you. And in my book, I write about it as the 3H core. I think humility is sort of how a leader sees themselves. I think I call it heart instead of humanness, but let's just call it heart, humanness. I think leaders that lead with a heart, that's sort of how they see other people. And honesty is sort of the transaction or the action that connects the two. In other words, you can be a really humble person. People can like you. Or you can be an incredibly human person doing things for other people. But if you're not honest, you'll never close that transaction. People will never trust you. And I think that that's really powerful. Humility, honesty, and heart. And they became the mantra as to how I tried to manage people. John Mack, it's funny, just as I was publishing the book, flew back up to New York and I actually met with him face to face. And I said, I want you to know how impactful you were to me, and how it's really the central tenet of the book. I really believe that the best leaders are humble, they're honest, and they're human.
Well stated. Thank you for that. I think anyone who is watching or listening, whether it's now live or whether it's later, can sense that heart in you. Walt, is one of the reasons that I was looking forward to this conversation. And I knew going into this that we could have a much longer conversation than we probably will have here. But there are a couple more things I want to ask before we go into the home stretch. And there's another H word that I think that while the situation that we're in, whether it's now on the last day of November or whether people are listening to this later in January when it comes out or beyond, maybe we're not in the crisis that you were in terms of an imminent bankruptcy of the company, but we all feel an awful lot of stuff related to this pandemic. And maybe in your organization, you're facing a crisis now or in the future. And the other H word I want you to talk about briefly is hope. How do you give people hope in a crisis? Because I think as leaders, that's part of our job too. What's your advice around that?
Well, I think it is important to give people hope. Don't get me wrong. I'm going to agree with you first, and then I'm going to throw a twist in. I think it is important to give people hope, but not false hope. Genuine hope.
That goes back to the honesty piece, right? It's got to be genuine.
That's exactly right. And I'll give you an example. Because people used to say to me all the time, "How did you give your people hope?" And sometimes I even contrast it and say, well, I'm not sure I did, because I believe in transparency, and I am generally an optimist. I believe that the glass is more half full than it is half empty. I think most people that know me would say that. But I also believe in honesty and transparency. So the balance for me was to get up in a town hall meeting, let's say, with my employees, which is really how I interacted with all of them at once. And basically the message was this: I want you to know that I'm hopeful that we can turn this company around. I want you to know that I believe that we are doing all the right things to do that. Let me tell you what they are. But I also want you, I don't want you to have false hope. We're on the ropes and we're working our butts off. And I need everybody out there to pull on the same oar. Okay. And there's a chance we don't make it. I don't think we won't, if you will. That's a double negative. And we're working hard not to, but I want to be balanced about this. I'm not going to come in and pound the table, and I'm not going to tell you we are going to make it. I'm just not that kind of leader. I think there's some leaders that can do that and create believability, but I'd rather be balanced. I'd rather my employees look at me and say, you know what? He's shooting straight with me. He's telling me exactly what he feels in his heart. And he does feel that there's an element of downside here. And so we need to work our butts off, and we need to believe him, and we need to know that he's working hard too, and they're doing they and the management team are doing everything they can, and that's how I believe I gave people hope, was through transparency and through honesty.
Yeah, the key there, agreed. I think that the point of, hey, we're working hard. Here's what we're doing. The world is uncertain. We don't know for sure. We believe we're doing all the right things. The further removed you are as a leader from those who are leading down you were at the ultimate, CEO and folks went down, the more they don't know that. And when they know that and you're looking them in the eye, even if it's through a video camera, and they see that is a hopeful message in that balanced sort of way. I really wanted you to share that, and I appreciate you doing that.
That's right. And look, we are in a very difficult time right now. There's some businesses that are thriving. Most businesses aren't. And there's some real emotional issues out there. So I want to get back to this whole notion of heart. I think leadership today is about empathy. It's about flexibility. It's about not necessarily micromanaging people. You got dogs barking in the background and babies crying in the background. And, if you can't be sympathetic as a leader during that, you'll never thrive and you'll never create trust. And so I think that we have to do more today as leaders than we have had to do in the past, at least in terms of empathy, flexibility, heart, and the like. But I think we have to be really careful with that word hope. I believe we're going to get through it. But I think it's going to look a lot different down the road for many of us. And I don't think we know at this point in time. So I think the more transparent and honest we are with people, the better.
Well, I put this, if you're watching, you see that I put up this last question that says advice to leaders today. And you just gave us some of that. Walt, was there anything else there, any other sort of final parting piece of advice before we start to wrap up that you would want to share?
Yeah, there is. There actually is. I think that tough times are actually your greatest opportunity. I heard a couple of weeks ago, I was on a conference call with Ed Bastian, who's the CEO of Delta. Now, this is a man whose revenues—
Talk about tough times.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't get any tougher. This is a man whose revenues went down 90% in the month of March. Okay, this is a man whose revenues, I'm going to guess, are still down by 30 or by over 50%. It has to be, right? So someone asked him, well, what's your part in comment, Ed? And he said, you know what? This is an amazing time. This is an amazing time to lead. He said, what an honor and what a privilege it is to lead during this difficult time. Adversity is actually your greatest opportunity. And I thought to myself, wow, how powerful is that? I think your listeners need to understand that they shouldn't let this crisis bring them down, get the best of them. They need to continue to persevere, let their character shine, and look at this as an opportunity that is an honor and a privilege. In other words, attitude matters. Attitude really does matter in leadership. And you look at a guy like this, if a guy like that can have that kind of attitude. Anybody can have that kind of attitude. And so that's my parting comment. That, and also I want to get back to the one thing I said before, and that is that we don't look at the destination. The destination looks kind of ugly at this point in time, but whatever that is, just remember the journey. The journey is all about how you treat people. The journey is all about, how you network with people, and it's what you see along the way. Sometimes we forget about that, but that's the most important aspect of leadership.
Well, we could end there, but we can't, because I have 3 questions I've got to ask.
Okay.
All quick questions. And one relates to the journey. So Walt, what do you do for fun?
Oh, well, I love golf. I'm an actor.
Not in Denver in November.
No, but I do live part of the year in Florida, so I'm able to do that. I love golf. Oh my gosh. I work out a decent amount, 3 to 4 times a week. I like to lift weights, do a decent amount of cardio. So I like to keep mentally fit. And so I do that. And my wife and I love to travel. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to do a lot of that in the last year or so, but that's what I like to do for fun.
All right. So one of the questions, and I know that you know this, but that I ask all of my guests is, so what are you reading, or what's something, Walt, that you've read recently?
Yep. So I read early in the year, I read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. That was powerful. Now, for those of your listeners that don't know, but Viktor Frankl was unfortunately captive in a Nazi concentration camp. And it was because he believed that if you had a purpose in life, a meaning in life, and you could continue to focus on that, you can get through anything. In other words, you need to have a why. I thought that was really a powerful book. And I just got done with it not too long ago, so it's front and center in my mind.
I would say to you, to all of you, if you've not read that book, it needs to be on the required reading list. And if anyone needed a positive attitude more than Ed Bastian at Delta, it was Viktor Frankl.
It was Viktor Frankl for sure.
This is not a hard, you're going to say, oh, it was written so far long ago. It's thin, it's powerful. It will stick with you. It is worth reading, Man's Search for Meaning. So thanks for that. And the question you've been wanting me to ask the most, I'm sure of all of them, Walt, is tell us more. How can people get connected with you? Where do they get the book? I'll hold the book up while you talk about that.
So Transfluence can be found. Best thing just be to go to my website. It's waltrakowich.com. WaltRakowich.com. Easiest place to find it. Of course, it's on Amazon, and you can find it, there too. I mean, so anyway, I'm really thankful that I had this opportunity.
Walt, it was absolutely my pleasure. So now my question for all of you who are watching and listening, whether it's now, live, or later, matters not. The question is, now what? What action are you going to take as a result of this? What do you need to spend some time thinking about based on the ideas that Walt has shared with us? What are your actions as a result? What do you need to think about in terms of vulnerability? What do you need to think about in terms of your fears and how they might be impacting you as a leader? What are your thoughts about humility, honesty, and heart? What actions will you take as a result of being here? That, at the end of the day, is what will make a difference, not just being entertained by the two of us for the last little bit. So let me close by saying that this episode has been brought to you by our new book, The Long Distance Teammate. You can learn more by going to longdistanceteammate.com. It's all about the difference between simply working at home and being an effective member of a remote team. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, and we hope that you will join us then. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kevin.